Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. My name is Suzanne Miller, and I am a principal researcher in the SEI Software Solution Division. Today, I'm happy to be joined by Marissa Midler and Samantha Chavez, both of whom work as penetration testers in the SEI CERT Division. Today, we're here to talk about their work on a penetration testing repository, something that I know some of the people in this field are going to be very appreciative of. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And Marissa, you have done a few podcasts with us previously, including one for My Story in Computing series, one of my favorite interviews that we've recorded. So we're going to include a link to that or go to the web and search on Marissa Midler and My Story in Computing for those of you that haven't seen it already. But Samantha has never been with us before. So Samantha, I'm going to let you start to tell us, our audience, a little bit about yourself. What brought you to this SEI team, and what is it that's so cool about the work that you do? So, Samantha, go ahead.
Sure. So I kind of have a little bit of a, crazy background, but I've been with SEI for almost 3 years now. I started as an intern straight from Florida State. I graduated with my master's in cybersecurity, and I interned first on the monitoring and response team, and then navigated into the applied network defense team. And I've been full-time with A&D for a year and a half now. But I was fortunate enough to get put on this project with Marissa, and it's definitely, like you said, something that's going to be very useful for the cybersecurity industry. But I would say that I guess the most interesting thing about the job is, one, there's so many projects. So it's not just, focusing on one thing. There's so many tools between coding, assessments, and all that stuff. I kind of get a feel for, a little bit of that, which is very nice. Because some people, they don't have the opportunity to be on so many projects. So I would definitely say that's the cool thing. It's always something different every day.
I tell people that if you're bored at the SEI, it's your own fault, because there's so many problems to solve, so many different ways to go about it, that there's no excuse for being bored. So you're definitely reinforcing that perspective. For those that have not seen your My Story in Computing, Marissa, why don't you give us a little summary of your background and what brought you here and what you think is cool about working here?
Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to give a very abridged version of it. You can see the full My Story in Computing if you're interested in learning more about me. But I went to grad school in the Heinz Information Security Policy and Management graduate program. I started interning at the SEI, and including my internships, I've been here for probably about 6 years now. And I just, like Sam said, I really like all the different projects that we get to work on. There's definitely a variety, and I'll also echo what you said. If you're bored here, that's probably your own fault, because there's plenty projects to hop on if you're looking for them.
And I've been here over 20 years, and I'm still not bored. So there you go. Okay, so today we're here to talk about a penetration testing repository that you recently built. And you've described this as a source for Active Directory, phishing, mobile technology, system, service, web application, wireless technology weaknesses that could be discovered during a penetration test. So this is essentially giving, in some ways, I look at it as almost like a very expanded checklist for people of, have you seen this? Have you seen this? Because you might. Is that sort of the quick summary of what you've done with this repository?
Not quite. The repository is kind of built out for different assessments. So you have your standard penetration testing assessments where Active Directory, phishing, system or service weakness, and web application weaknesses, those categories would fit well into just your standardized penetration test. But then the mobile assessments and the wireless assessments, those aren't always included on penetration testing assessments. They're typically their own type of assessments. And we built out common findings that assessors will find on those types of assessments as well. So it includes a little bit of everything, to be honest, and it's meant to be to help the assessor kind of give standardized language overall to the assessed organization. So ultimately, we're just trying to standardize these finding names and help out the assessors, save them time on report generation by having these descriptions and standard remediations and everything else that's in the repository kind of in there for them to use.
So question comes, why is it important to do that? What's the cyber landscape like right now that it makes it important to have that kind of standardized view of findings from penetration testing?
So I would say it's important because right now everybody is kind of naming these things whatever they are coming up with on assessments, which is not wrong. It's just like if we're wanting to try to do some data analysis on assessments overall, so like a vast majority of these assessments, like standardizing these naming conventions is very important to kind of identify which findings are identified on all these different types of assessments.
So data analysis, and then probably also in terms of just metrics reporting, how many of this type, how many of that type. If you don't have any kind of standardized nomenclature, then you're not going to be able to provide any of those standardized measures. Is that one of the intentions of the repository, to support that?
It depends on how the organization uses it. So the repository itself is just a tool for people to use. It's a giant, right now the format is an Excel document, and people can ingest that into a report web application, like a report generation web application, and use it that way, or they can use it as the Excel file and kind of just use it as a reference. I think Sam had something that she wanted to say to add to this.
I was just going to bounce off of what Marissa said, because you did ask, why is it so important to have the standardization? And, when we did our data analysis and we were actually looking at all of the findings that we had originally, we realized that assessors on these assessments kind of worded the findings in different ways. So some people would find a specific finding, and it would actually, the name of it would be a process, or it would be an attack rather than the actual vulnerability that's being found on these assessments. So when Marissa and I were looking at them, we said, okay, maybe we can, take all of these 10 attacks that are originally listed, and just all these 10 attacks can actually map to one specific vulnerability. So essentially creating the standardization amongst all the findings to pretty much pinpoint the exact vulnerability that's being found in the assessments, rather than, the processes that we found originally in the flat list.
So you've given us a little bit about it's an Excel, basically an Excel spreadsheet is the sort of foundational form of the repository. But why don't you give us a little bit more of an overview of the repository, how it works, and how you actually built it?
So the findings repository is a tiered classification system. So we have those 6 categories that you mentioned earlier, which are Active Directory, phishing, mobile technology, system or service weakness, web application weakness, and wireless technology weakness. So that's layer 1. And then within those layers, we have general findings, which are exactly what they sound like, a more generalized finding. And then the next layer down is specific findings, which are more specific findings. So they kind of pinpoint one particular type of finding. And these layers, without seeing the actual repository, it's kind of hard to describe it verbally, but there are 27 general findings, and then there are 111 specific findings. So this covers a lot. It's not all encompassing. But the idea is that the community, since this is open source, they can look at this, add to it, and we will want to add to it too as there are new findings and vulnerabilities that are identified as the years progress. But ultimately, it's that tiered system. So assessors, when they're looking through this thing, if they're like, oh, I found something with Active Directory, they're going to go into the Active Directory category and then look through the general findings. They might see something that sounds like generalized what they're looking for, and then look within the specific findings to see if there's something specific to their finding. If not, they can use the generalized finding.
And have you got a mechanism for people to give back to you new findings? Because that's one of the things about this whole area is the threats change. So do you have a way for people to bring back, hey, I think I found a new finding for the repository, if other people are also seeing this?
So right now, the findings repository is hosted on SEI's GitHub. I don't know if SEI has opened up that functionality, but I do believe that has been the plan. So off the top of my head, I do not know.
Okay, that's fine. And but people should look at systems that GitHub. We'll give the GitHub website in the transcript, of course. That's where they would look to see if they wanted to provide some feedback as to other things that they're finding.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So I can certainly imagine if I'm a new penetration tester, that this is going to be a godsend for me because it helps me to organize my thinking. It helps me to look at things. But what are some other use cases besides sort of the beginner penetration tester that you see this repository being used for?
Well, I kind of do fall into that beginner level. So it's kind of deviating from your question a little bit, but during the time that I was actually working on this with Marissa, I went on my first pen test. So, as a beginner coming out of school and never actually, conducting an assessment, you're kind of like, well, what am I supposed to be looking for? Or what are, a list of common vulnerabilities that you do find in assessments. So while I was working on that, and I got placed on the assessment, it was a little bit easier as far as pinpointing, okay, what am I looking for, right? How can I remediate this? Or just actually finding that, standardized language to put into a report for an assessment. So that helped a lot. But I would definitely say another pro or another useful way to use this is just for report writing in general. When you're on these assessments, assessors spend so much time trying to figure out how do I word this specific finding, or, what are some resources that, whether those are blog posts, tutorials, like how is that going to help me mitigate this vulnerability? So essentially what the repository is supposed to help with is minimize that effort for report writing and trying to figure out, okay, spelling and grammar and all of that stuff. So that's probably one of the biggest usage of the repository, for people on an assessment.
Okay.
And I can add to that,
Sure.
With the report writing aspect, so the report's what the customer actually gets their hands on, and with those additional resources, of how to remediate it, it's also helping give the assessed organization better resources to fix these findings or vulnerabilities.
So in the repository, you not only have the vulnerability, but you have suggested resources to look at for that. So we're not, I love this because so many times in the past, the SEI has been accused of, well, you tell us where all the problems are, but you don't help us tell us how to fix them. So this is a counter case where you actually are helping people to understand, how am I going to fix this? And it's not necessary. I know that our audience won't think that it's a be all end all, but it's a place to start.
Yeah.
When you're looking at those kinds of vulnerabilities.
I was just going to say, so you had mentioned a point as, there's several things that are within the repository. So you have the description, you have your remediation, your references and resources. And in addition to that, we actually have controls from cybersecurity frameworks that maybe Marissa would like to elaborate on, but there's so many resources and things that you can find from this repository, not just your vulnerabilities. Because like you said, there's people you just tell me what's wrong, but how can I fix it? Or what are some resources? So those are pretty much all of the components that go into the general findings and the specific findings of the repository.
Marissa, did you want to say anything about the standards?
Yeah, I can give you a high level overview of what is in there. So we have the NIST cybersecurity framework, we mapped findings to that control framework, version 1.1, because when we did this work, that was the most up-to-date version. So we'll eventually have to go back in there and update it to version 2 that recently came out. We also have it mapped to the NIST special publication 800-53, revision 5, and we also mapped it to the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls version 8.
Okay.
And each finding has mappings to those 3 frameworks.
So this is a very rich resource. And I think that's really one of the reasons we're talking today, is to make sure that people are aware of this kind of a rich resource that is going to help assessors that are doing penetration testing find and fix things that are worthy. The question that comes up in my mind, and it's sort of a little bit tangential, but how do you decide when you're out on an assessment, what is, the way I'll phrase it, what is worthy of being, kind of included as a finding? What's, does the repository help you figure out what's that level of abstraction that I should be looking for? Because I can imagine just myself, that would be one of the hardest things for me, is like, is this worth talking about? Or is this too, fine a detail? Or, how does the repository help with that? If at all, it may not.
Yeah, it does. The specific findings are all commonly identified findings that we thought were important to include to be reported on when a pen tester is out there doing an assessment. But just as a general rule, what you report to a customer, in my opinion, is I try to put myself in the customer's shoes. And if I was an organization, like, what would I want to know is a risk to me in my organization? And if I think that the assessed organization would want to know about that, then I would report on it. It's kind of a judgment call.
Yeah, that's a nice rule of thumb. So thank you. Sam, I'm just curious, because you said you were kind of in that sort of more newer to pen testing mode. Is that one of the things that you found helpful with the repository, that you kind of had a better idea of what's the right level of abstraction to be dealing with on the findings?
Absolutely. And I think too, so there is a column within the repository that's a severity level. And that was determined by our customer CISA. So I kind of got a feel of, okay, which vulnerability is more informational, which one has a severity level of low or high. So you kind of saw some deep in the weeds, and then you had some general ones, but the repository has all various levels of types of vulnerabilities. So I think that definitely helped a lot. And like Marissa said, there's probably still more that we can add into the findings repository. But essentially what we did create was one of pretty much the most common ones that assessors would find on assessments. But the severity levels definitely helped with that.
I just want to jump in with that severity level. That's just like a starting point. It's not the end all be all level. So it can be subjective based on the assessment and what type of environment an organization has set up. So it could be raised to be more severe or even lowered.
Gotcha. All right. So where have you beta tested this? Have you had any organizations use this and given you feedback on it? And if so, we always like to know not only how does it work well, but are there any drawbacks that people should be aware of if they're going to try and use this?
So we know that it's in use, but we didn't really have a beta test per se. So it's being utilized. This kind of started from a flat list of findings that was definitely used for years. And that was like the beta test where we got feedback to build out this more expansive findings repository. So this particular one, we're still looking for feedback on it, but we did build it from something that was more of a flat list that was used and tested for years.
All right, so it's got a strong base in terms of the content of it is well known, and really what you're doing, that standardization piece of language and the layering is really what you're adding. and then all the resources. I'm imagining the flat list didn't really have all the resources that you're adding to the repository now that help people fix things. So it sounds like it was a big improvement to the original product that you're using.
And this one is open source, so we're able to share it with everyone. The original was not.
Okay. All right. That's a good point too. So this takes me into the topic of transition. You've got an open source product, so anybody can get to it. But beyond sort of getting to the repository and playing in the sandbox, what kinds of resources are available to people from us or from CISA to help them understand how to use it, how to do some of the things you were talking about earlier, like bringing it into organizational reporting and things like that? Or do we have resources for people that support that kind of transition?
I'm not aware of any right now. We are building out the blog post to help introduce people to the findings repository. This podcast we're recording to introduce people to the findings repository. But if there's interest, I'm sure we can come up with something else for the public to use to help them take advantage of this great work product.
So I will interpret that as a call for, if you see this and you think you need some help with it, contact us. We might be able to help we might have something already built, or we may have something that we can build as part of the open source community for this. So you're at the beginning of the transition of this. Really, this is a new product, and so you're at the beginning of sort of figuring out what people need to be able to use this productively.
If I can add to that.
Sure.
So even though we may not have, resources out there, there is still ways. Let's say you have an application, because we currently use the repository and ingest it into an application for, good usability for front end and stuff like that. So it's easily ingestible. And pretty much, if you do have this application, all right, you can pretty much select your category. You can select your finding, or your general finding, and then you can select your specific finding. So even though we may not have anything out there right now, it's still good to use if you have an application that maybe you use for assessments, stuff like that. So
it's adaptable, is what it sounds like, to different environments. Okay, well, that's always a good start, because adaptation is something that we need to make sure our technologies can support. So you've got the first version of this done. So in the interest of not being bored, what's next for you two? I know you've got a blog post for this in the works, but what else are you working on that we might want to bring you back to talk about in a little while?
So I'm actually currently working on a risk repository. So essentially, instead of honing down into the vulnerabilities that you find on these assessments, now this risk repo is going to focus on all of the risks that you can find. Same thing, it's going to have a description, it's going to have a recommendation. I'm not sure if it's going to have cybersecurity controls, but definitely those are being used to help write these descriptions and recommendations and stuff like that. So that's in the works. I don't know when it will be publicly released or if it will be, but that's something that's being done in the back end.
What about you, Marissa? What are you working on?
I am building some security tools, but none of these have any plans for being open source. So unfortunately, I can't really talk about
Not
them.
all of them can be. So, all right. Well, I do want to thank both of you for talking with us today. As everyone knows, we will include links in the transcript to things we've talked about in the podcast. And I do look forward to seeing future things from the two of you. I think you're both the type of people that are going to have your fingers in lots of different pies as time goes on. So that'll be fun. I do finally want to make a reminder to our audience that our podcasts are available lots of places: SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple, Google, and of course, my favorite, the SEI YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear today, you're welcome to give us a thumbs up and tell your friends. So I want to thank you both again for joining us today, and I want to thank our audience as well.
Thank you, Suze.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.